All right, hi, and welcome to our lecture material on race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status, or SES. Because reading is relevant to college students' lives and analyzes journals from white college students and students of color for kind of experiences with racist remarks. And so it gives us an opportunity to think about how challenging those moments are and what ideas you have for thinking on your feet about responding to racist remarks. Peggy McIntosh's reading on white privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack is a landmark reading in the field. It's older, of course, but I keep it in here because I still think it's very powerful and relevant. Okay, so the Rockmore and Henderson reading is on interracial families, and we'll be talking more about some of that research on interracial couples. And I think it also helps shed light on this idea of colorblindness, which is appealing in many ways, but has some problems associated with it. And as you can see, it's related to how we talked about alpha and beta bias from the gender lecture. So beta bias would be considered like colorblindness, and alpha bias would be an exaggeration of racial differences. So this is a video, not a reading. It's short. And Deva Pager presents her research on hiring practices following felony convictions for white and black men. And it ends up being a study on implicit bias as well. And I'd like you to pay attention. Who's more likely to receive a callback from a job interview? A white man with a criminal record or a black man without one? So in this lecture, we're going to spend most of our time on issues related to race. We're going to go over some of the perceptions, American perceptions of racial issues. We're going to talk about this idea of racial literacy. Then we're going to talk about critical race theory as it is used in human development and family studies, more specifically around the social construction of race and systemic racism, and within that, implicit bias, which you may have learned about. We're going to spend just a little bit of time, not much, in this lecture on socioeconomic status, but we will focus on the important family stress model, and then we close out with an activity related to our own ethnicities. Okay, let's get started with our lecture material related to race. So race is obviously a very controversial issue in our society right now, and I'm going to be doing my best in this lecture to represent the current research and theorizing on race in the human development and family studies field. So I've got a couple of slides on the perception of race relations in the United States, and I'm going to ask you to think for each of these, how do you make sense of these differences in perception by race? So here we can see that the majority of Americans do say that race relations are more on the bad side than the good side in the United States, although there's a lot of variation there. And you can particularly see that Black Americans are the most likely to say that race relations are poor and the least likely to say that it's good, whereas white Americans are a little bit more split, with about 44% saying they're generally good and about 56% saying it's bad, and then Hispanic Americans in the middle. Okay, so this asks about whether or not we've gone far enough to give equal rights for Black people. And this was really designed to gather change associated with the Black Lives Movement and to show changes between 2019 and 2020. And we can see that there was an increased perception that we haven't gone far enough across racial groups. I think Asian was only measured in 2020, not in 2019. But we can also use this graph to see that, for example, Black people are dramatically more likely to say that we have not gone far enough to achieve equal rights for them compared to white people specifically, and then Asian and Hispanic Americans being somewhere in the middle. Okay, so this is the percentage of adults saying, which is a bigger problem for the country, that we are not seeing racial discrimination where it really does exist, and where we are seeing racial discrimination where it really does not exist. And you can see here that overall, white Americans are a little more likely on the side to say we are seeing racial discrimination where it does not exist. We're, exaggerating it. Whereas Black, Hispanic, and Asian Americans are much more likely to say, especially for Black Americans, to say, we are not seeing it where it does exist, we're ignoring it. So for me, when I think about these slides, how do I make the sense of perceptions by race? The takeaway for me is that if you want to know if something is a problem, you have to ask the people who are most likely to experience the problem. So you can't be asking white people about their perceptions about racial issues and thinking that that's accurate, because that's not the reality that they're living in. So I put these slides up about gender to just kind of illustrate that there's a parallel there. If you ask men and women if we've gone far enough to give equal rights to women, men are a little bit more split. Like, oh, some say we haven't gone far enough. Some say we've done about right, in giving equal rights for women. Whereas women are more clearly, on average, saying, no, we haven't quite gone far enough. In terms of men have it easier or there's no difference, everyone seems to agree that men have it easier, but women are much more likely to see that, to think that men have it easier than men are. So my point is, again, the people who aren't experiencing the discrimination might not be accurate reporters on the challenge that it creates. Another parallel would be, if we want to know if our buildings at CSU are accessible to people with disabilities, it makes the most sense to ask the people with disabilities, not just do a campus-wide poll on whether or not we've solved this issue. So I think that's important to think about. We can't weight the opinions of people who haven't experienced the issue as heavily as people who have experienced the issue, in my opinion. So my goal for myself and for us as a class, and I'm guessing you may have this goal too, is one of racial literacy. And this is drawn from the Rockmore and Henderson reading that you're doing. And racial literacy means that we are acknowledging that racial identities are socially constructed. And with that there's a symbolic value associated with having lighter skin or whiteness. And that we are trying to understand racialization or racialized practices. And we're going to be getting more into all of that. That we perceive racism as a current, ongoing issue, not something that was in our past. That we try to have the vocabulary to discuss it. That we understand the intersectionality that we've talked about already, but viewing racism as tied to other inequalities. And that we try to tolerate our discomfort with discussions about race. So I had this t-shirt in college and I loved it. I bought it in my students' union and I wore it, proudly all the time with my cute little jean shorts. And so let's talk about this all one people ideology. And I similarly, I had a Maya Angelou poem that I loved from that time that was called The Human Family. And the quote from it was, in minor ways we differ, in major we're the same. So let's talk about kind of what are the pros and cons of this ideology. And so on the one hand, it's great that, I have this kind of view of humanity as we're all connected, we're all one people. But the challenge is then if I start focusing on sameness, we're all the same, then I'm falling into that very appealing kind of colorblind stance, which is a great ideal, but what we find is that it's not really real, as we're going to be learning with implicit bias, and it's ignoring the very real differences and discriminations people face. It's like minimizing that. So maybe you have other thoughts too. Those are kind of my takeaways. So the rest of this material on race will be using critical race theory as its framework. And how we typically talk about critical race theory in HDFS, although there's a lot of variations, is we focus on the social construction of race at the individual and institutional or societal level. And we also think about racism and bias at the individual and the institutional or societal level, which we typically then call structural racism. Critical race theory also does focus on intersectionality, but I'm not focused on that so much in this lecture. So the primary mechanism by which our social constructions of race lead us to kind of racism is through the process of racialization. And this is us basically creating categories based on real, perceived, or ascribed kind of racial differences, and then assigning kind of meaning and power associated with that. And I just think all the time about how we are innately wired to categories. If you've taken a child development class, you know that infants start categorizing right away between like numbers 2 and 3. There's a difference between animals and vehicles. Birds look different than airplanes in pictures. So, and it seems to be kind of evolutionarily related to our survival. We do this with kind of in-group, out-group phenomenon. You know, people who look like me, I associate more positive things with. People who don't look like me, I associate more negative things with. And so, you know, basically we are kind of wired to do this categorizing, making meaning. We live in kind of stratified societies where we give things more status and more importance and more privilege. And so racialization isn't necessarily racism. It can be, but it sets the stage for racism to occur. So this is older research, but I still think really relevant and illustrates racialization. So this is the research study, the National Longitudinal Study of Youth, which was a 20-year study between 1979 and 1998. Interviewers met with respondents each year in person, and at the end of the year, they were instructed to kind of mark on their sheet what the racial category was of their interviewee: white, black, or other. And for about 20% of respondents, and we might imagine that these might be individuals with lighter skin tones who weren't easily categorized, their racial classification by interviewer changed. And it could have gone back and forth between like white and black, as you can see by those letters there. Or it could have been that first they were categorized as white and later they were categorized as black, or vice versa. And controlling for any error, the researchers found that people who were classified as white the year before were less likely to be reclassified as white that year if they were interviewed while they were in prison, if they reported that they had been unemployed about 4 months of the time, or if they were currently living below the poverty line. And they were more likely to be classified as black again, kind of reclassified as black, if they were interviewed in prison, unemployed, or below the poverty line. So this helps us understand how people are using kind of the meaning of racial groups to create categories, right? And so if I'm implicitly thinking, okay, well, gosh, if you're here in prison and I can't quite read your skin tone, you must be black, you know, is kind of the unconscious process that I'm doing. Whereas maybe if I'm not sure, but you seem to be doing well, I rate you as white. Respondents in this study were also asked to self-identify their racial category, black, white, or other, in just 2 years. The very first year, 1978, and then in 2002. So I'm not sure if that was a 5-year follow-up or the official end of the study. And basically, respondents who self-identified as white in 1979 were less likely to reclassify themselves as white in 2002 if they were in prison, unemployed, or below the poverty line. And respondents who self-identified as black in 1979 were more likely to continue to identify as black if they were in prison, unemployed, or below the poverty line. So it's interesting that this is not just people doing it to us, racialization, it's also us doing it to ourselves, particularly if maybe we're biracial and we have some kind of fluidity in how we could identify. And so this does help us illustrate that racial identification isn't set in stone, it's fluid. Either this is at the individual level, but of course we're going to be talking about the institutional level too. And it's really tied to social status and the meaning that we make around these created racial categories. The U.S. Census is another place where we can understand the social construction of race. So the U.S. Census began after the American Revolution and the Constitution of the United States in 1790, and it was conducted every 10 years. It is still conducted every 10 years, and so you can go to the link there if you want to see all the years. I couldn't fit them all on the slide. And so I have been thinking about this a lot since I reviewed this, and I wonder what you think the takeaways are. You might see things that I don't. I noticed that this shows us the social construction of race, how it changes over time, how we haven't been able to agree on what the races are. Race, no one can agree that it's biological. It definitely doesn't seem to be tied to genes. And the dominant white group, as we can also see, controls the narrative because that's who was creating the census questions. And so I think it's interesting to look at this and just notice even the inconsistencies, that, for example, white and black never include countries of origin. We don't say German or Italian or Irish for white. For black, we don't mention any countries in Africa. We don't say Ghanaian, or Nigerian. However, for the Asian countries, we list the country, which I think is so interesting. And same with Pacific Islander, we're listing the countries. Mexican is mentioned very briefly, but not regularly, even though we're talking about a lot of other countries. And I don't know the history there. Maybe you do. American Indian isn't mentioned until later, perhaps because they were not taxed, it sounds like. And then 2000 was the first year that you could pick more than one category, which really reflected a shift in our social construction of race, that you didn't just have to fit into one box. So this study is an example of the social construction of race at the individual, not institutional level, like the census. It's mentioned in your Rockamore and Henderson reading. So this is a study of young adults who had one black parent and one white parent. And they interviewed them on how they constructed their identity. So technically they're all biracial, but there was variation in how they thought of their own racial identity. And so some thought of themselves, the most common one was the border identity, where they identified as biracial, refusing to be categorized as one or the other, but also acknowledging that they may experience the world as a black person, due to the one-drop rule and its legacy. There were others who identified as a singular identity. Even though they were biracial, they identified as either black or white, which was often influenced by their skin tone and how other people perceived them, or who they lived with, for example, if they were living with their black parent or their white parent. And then protean is that racial identity that changes and shifts based on who the person is with and their social context. And so sometimes maybe you're thinking yourself as black, and sometimes you're thinking of yourself as biracial. So when we think of Obama, he was often hailed as the first black president, but he identified in that way, but then he also would refer to himself as a mutt, I'm biracial. So his racial identity maybe shifted sometimes based on the context or what box people were putting him in. And then transcendent identity is, I don't consider myself to be black, white, or biracial. I just want to be seen as a unique person. Maybe I have other identities that are stronger for me, like Catholic, or I'm an engineering major, but race is not salient. And so regardless of whether or not you're biracial, you might be thinking about kind of your own social identity construction and what you would say here. You may have heard of the one-drop rule, also called hypodescent. And I encourage you to watch just a little bit of this video clip of Professor Yaba Blay talking about what it means. But essentially, these were state laws, typically in the South, starting around 1910 or in between 1910 and 1930, lasting up until the Supreme Court, overturned the bans on interracial marriage in 1967. And this basically classified someone as black if they had one drop of black blood, so one black ancestor anywhere in their line. Prior to this, people were classified as mulatto if they were, and it depended on the state, a quarter black, an eighth black, a 16th black. But this was called hypodescent, and it meant that if you had one drop of black blood, you were considered black. And so hypodescent means you were afforded the lower social status of that union. So between someone who was white and someone who was black, if you were born of mixed race, you were of lower status. And even though it was overturned in 1967, the legal notion of hypodescent actually was held up, as I understand it, upheld as recently as 1985, when the Louisiana court ruled that a woman with a black great-great-great-great-great-grandmother could not identify herself as white on her passport. And so when we think about kind of the meaning that we create around racial categories here, this was designed to preserve the purity of the white race and the implication that black blood was then impure. Understanding the social construction of race and being racially literate also means that we understand the symbolic value of whiteness, and that colorism exists around the world, with lighter skin being privileged, people using skin bleaching creams, and with that, straighter hair, people straightening their hair, having lighter color eyes, all kind of signs of higher status or privilege. And whiteness in America is the norm. It's invisible. Being Anglo-American or Euro-American is kind of the norm. And you'll see that in this funny video, which I think is highly worth watching, where he says, "Oh, I'm just American," whereas Korean has been considered actually a distinct race, by the U.S. Census in the past, not just a country of origin. You may have already read this, and even if you have, it's worth rereading. Peggy McIntosh it's older now, identified 50 privileges that she has as a white woman that her black friends and colleagues and counterparts don't have. And if white privilege, rubs you the wrong way as a white person, remember white privilege isn't saying that as a white person your life hasn't been hard for a multitude of reasons. But it just means that the color of your skin hasn't been one of the things making it harder. So of these that I put on this slide, I, as a white person, have all these privileges. And so the way I think about it is just all the subtle ways that I move about in the world where I don't actually have to think about the color of my skin. When I walk around in Old Town or across campus and someone looks at me in a slightly odd way or for too long or whatever, I never even wonder if it's because of the color of my skin. If I get accepted for something, a position or award, I don't wonder, did they take me because of the color of my skin? I don't ever have to think about it as I move about in the world. Whereas I think I don't have to, worry about, is my skin too light? Is my skin too dark? It's never something, how are people perceiving me? Never something that's come into my mind. And so how I think about it more is the absence of stress associated with the color of my skin as I move through the world. And so, yes, I'm curious what you think on this, how you would weigh in, and you can always write about this in your online discussion if you're not in a face-to-face class. Do you think that your American white people need to acknowledge their privilege? So let's talk about the social construction of race and how it relates to interracial or interethnic marriages, which is associated with the Rockmore and Henderson reading that you're doing. So overall, interracial, and I'll say mostly interracial, but it can include interethnic marriages, have been less common due to racialization, which we already talked about, giving different status and power and meaning to different quote-unquote races or skin colors. And also this belief of racial endogamy, which is that you should marry your own kind, essentially. I can remember growing up and my dad telling me I needed to marry a Christian. Obviously, that's more religious endogamy. So it was rare prior to 1970, and then we saw a rise after 1970. So as you may have already learned, the Supreme Courts in 1967 ruled in favor of Loving in the Loving versus Virginia decision, and this struck down interracial marriage. Prior to this, different state laws varied. So for example, New York and Illinois didn't prohibit interracial marriage, but it was rare. There were only about 1% of couples were interracially married. So since then, we've been seeing an increase. You can see that reflected there in the graph. As of 2019, about 17% of new marriages are interracial. And so why are we seeing these increases? Obviously, we legalized it. We also, with the civil rights movement, have an improvement, although still struggles for sure, in race relations, greater acceptance of diversity. We have higher rates of immigration, continuing to make a more diverse nation. And so that can increase interracial marriages, but can also increase same-race marriages, because if more people come in who are Hispanic or Asian, can also lead to more same-race marriages too. I think one of the big factors is the rising age of marriage. So now it's later 20s that people are getting married. And so instead of just getting married right out of your hometown, where maybe you were with a more homogenous group racially, you've been going to college, or you've been traveling, or you've been working, you've been encountering kind of a broader range of potential mates than you would have if you married at 20. We also know that even second marriages are more likely to be interracial than first marriages. So it seems that as people move through life, either they increase in tolerance, acceptance, they meet more diverse people, which can lead to higher rates. Research does suggest that if people marry interracially or interethnically, they're more likely to be similar in terms of education and social class. That's homogamy or similarity. So, for example, you might both have college degrees, or you both might not have college degrees. I married interethnically, not interracially. My husband is Jewish. We were the first in both sides of our family to marry someone not of the same ethnicity or religion. So I was the first non-Jew on my husband's side, and he was the first non-Christian on my side. But we were both earning undergraduate degrees when we met, so we were similar in terms of our SES. Interracial marriage is still, though, less common, even with the increases, than intermarriage between people with low and high education. So people are more likely to marry someone of a different educational background than they are of a different race, more likely to marry someone of a different religious background than they are of a different race. You can also see from this graph that marriages, well, you can't totally see this in the graph, but Black-white marriages have grown 7 times since 1960, but they remain the least likely combination of interracial marriages. Asian and white interracial marriages are the most common, but as you can see, they're declining. The Rockmore and Henderson reading also talks about kind of some trends in attitudes versus behavior by Black and white Americans, and that's the only people they were studying, only 2 racial groups. And what they found is that white individuals were more likely to say, oh yes, I approve of interracial marriage, that would be fine. But then if someone close to them does it, they're more likely to express disapproval. Whereas Black Americans were, on average, on the reverse, more likely to say, no, you should marry a good Black man or a good Black woman. But then if their friends don't do that, or family members, then they were more supportive. Now, obviously, these are just trends and people can vary. And then border patrolling, which I'm guessing many of you may have experienced, is when either kind of subtly or overtly, either kind of a discouragement or hostility, people are kind of sent the message that you shouldn't be doing this quote unquote border crossing. And so then this is again based on this idea of racialization. We create meaning around these racial groups that we've constructed. We assign them different social status, and we also have a belief that you should stay within your own group. And so this might be things like, girl, you couldn't find yourself a good, Black man, or, what, there's no white boys at your school, or, just little comments like that. Or it could be someone kind of yelling out their car window at you, or refusing to serve you, or treating you with hostility, not being very nice to you when you're out as a couple. So yeah, I'll be curious to hear about your own experiences. So as you recall, we're focusing on 2 tenets of critical race theory. First, the social construction of race, which we've been talking about. And now we're going to transition more into talking about structural, institutional, or systemic racism. I'm using all those words interchangeably. So why do we have, what is it and why do we have it? So It's basically inequities in our legal, educational, medical, and criminal justice systems in all of our systems. This video is, I think, very helpful, the Systemic Racism Explained video, because it gives specifics. If you're ever trying to come up with like, well, what are some examples? It talks, for example, about current policies, and these are considered family policies in our field around how schools are funded through property taxes, old policies that are now outlawed around redlining, but the impact that they continue to have on intergenerational wealth, and then also segregation and its continued impact on intergenerational wealth. Obviously, there's a lot of policies that have had implications for why we still see inequities today. Even if those policies are still no longer legal, they have trickle-down effects. And so it's current and old policies that have led to systemic racism, and then it's also implicit bias, which we'll be spending quite a bit more time talking about. Policy, we will revisit at the very end of this class and probably not spend enough time on it. It's such an important area, though. Okay, so I'd really strongly recommend that you watch this TED Talk by Professor Jerry Kang on implicit bias. And the key takeaways are, of course, like we've been talking about, our brains automatically create categories, and that results in stereotypes, some of which we're aware of, we can articulate, which would be explicit bias, and some which we would say, no, we don't have, but we do, in the form of implicit bias. You may have already learned about the implicit association test. We're going to spend some time talking about it. You may have already taken it. But as you know, it measures implicit bias based on a number of different social identities. So it started with race, but has been moved to, address a number of different social identities. And as Dr. Kang's TED Talk is going to show us, implicit bias predicts behavior. And so this is just a screenshot from his TED Talk summarizing some of the research on implicit bias and how it affects decision making. Okay, well, if you haven't already taken an implicit association test, I encourage you to give it a try. There's a lot of different implicit biases that you can test for. I've done a couple of them and came up biased, even though explicitly I wouldn't identify as having that bias. So this is highly worth listening to. This is Deva Pager's research in which she recruited 2 white men, 2 black men, and each week assigned one of them to have a criminal record and the other one not to. None of them ever did. And then had them apply for jobs. And then kept data on how likely they were to get a call back. And what's crazy about her findings are that a white man with a felony conviction is more likely to receive a callback than a black man with no criminal record, which seems to me to be pretty profound indication of implicit bias. But there's other important things that can be taken from the video as well. I ran across this research study, which I thought was in many ways an example of implicit bias. So the researcher targeted white admissions counselors across the nation, basically identifying them as white by finding their photographs on university websites, and then sending them emails from fictitious black students, so picking distinctly black names like Lakeisha and Kishwan, and then this researcher created 4 email templates from these students that demonstrated their interest in one of 4 areas: math and English, environmental sustainability, African American history and culture, or anti-racism. And in each one of these fictitious emails from these students, the student, he or she, asked if they would be a good fit for the school based on their interests and activities. He sampled over 500 white admissions counselors at private and historically and predominantly white colleges across the U.S. They each got 2 of the 4 emails from 2 fictitious black high school students approximately 1 month apart. And let's see what else I want to tell you here. What he found was that white admissions counselors were on average 26% less likely to respond to the emails of Black students whose interests and involvements focused on anti-racism and racial justice. So if they said they were interested in math and English or environmental sustainability or African American history, they were more likely to get an email response back kind of affirming, yes, you'd be welcome here, than if they said they were interested in anti-racism or racial justice. The gender of the counselor and the student also mattered. White male counselors were 37% less likely to respond to anti-racist Black students, especially if they were a Black woman. So a Black woman interested in environmental sustainability got a response rate of 74%, whereas a Black woman who was saying she was interested in anti-racism or social justice got a response rate of 37%. So in my mind, that's an implicit bias that's perhaps even more triggered around fear around, anti-racism, racial justice, kind of activism. If you haven't seen this commercial before, I'd encourage you to check it out. This TED Talk by Brene Myers is excellent and discusses implicit bias, how to handle colorblindness, what are some potential strategies for overcoming our implicit biases when and if we notice them. And so we can be thinking about kind of strategies that we use. So I'll just tell you a story from a few years ago. I went to Paris with my mom. And of course, as we're preparing to go to Paris, we're reading emails, or I'm reading travel books that are like, you got to be careful when you're getting on the subway. There's pickpocketers, And so when we were getting on the subway, I noticed that I was just like more nervous, right? My fear was up. And so you walk onto the subway and you're trying to figure out where you're going to stand or where you're going to sit. And I noticed that after a couple of days, I was avoiding standing or sitting near a young man of color. And once I realized that, I felt ashamed, of course, and I felt empathy for all these young men of color who must watch people get on the subway, glance at them, and then go stand or sit somewhere else. And so once I noticed that in myself, I decided I was going to do, the opposite. I was going to move towards them. I was going to relax my body. I was going to smile, and I was going to sit or stand next to them. And so that was one of my ways of just noticing and changing kind of my bias responses. I also subscribe, like on social media, to the Dad Gang, which is Black fathers just showing lots of videos of them and their kids to kind of help overcome any implicit biases I have from growing up, about Black fatherhood. And then the last little bullet point on this slide is just thinking, like, how do you counter racist remarks from those close to you, either face-to-face or on social media or online? This ties to the PICA reading that you've done. So we have a chance to reflect about that as well, either online or in our face-to-face discussions. You can ponder your answer to this question. There was a period of time where it was perhaps less likely for people to acknowledge that they were racist or had, unintentional, racist actions or thoughts or perceptions. But I think we're increasingly seeing that certainly, people who are white are needing to acknowledge our own racism or our own implicit biases. Okay, so let's transition into just a few slides on socioeconomic status, or SES. So I think if you've taken other HDFS classes, we're often talking about kind of differences by social class, and we'll continue to do that in this class. For example, when we're talking about marriage and divorce. And so all of these things on the slide can be influenced by social class, which in social class is defined by basically income and education and the type of job that you have. And so social class creates kind of its own culture with its own kind of trends. And so we might, even though I'm not going into each of these individually, we can know that there's differences in kind of sexual behavior, for example, or how you think about diet and health and their behaviors, how long your life expectancy, housing experiences, what's considered good fashion, and to stop and focus for a minute on what it's like to be a first-gen student, because that's an example of social class. And so colleges at least colleges like CSU are kind of middle class institutions, and so if you're coming maybe first gen, maybe from a working class family, for example, you can really feel like you don't belong, and that's one reason why, and you don't have the same support, that's one reason why we place such an emphasis on being first gen here at CSU in the last decade or so, and try to provide more support for it, because research suggests that people just on average have less support when they're first gen. They don't have parents who can necessarily know how the system works and how do you declare a major and when to meet with your advisor and how to handle financial aid and having to fill out the FAFSA. I had the exact opposite of being first gen, in that both my parents had PhDs by the time I graduated from college. And so they were able to support me through undergrad, through my master's program, through my PhD. My parents knew exactly everything that I was doing. When I was talking about writing my dissertation, they knew what that meant. They knew what it meant to take my qualifying exams, and my mom edited both my thesis and my dissertation for me. So what an amazing gift, right? To have that level of support. And as a college professor, I'm doing an amazing job helping my kids through college, because I know kind of what everything is and how to advise them and how to guide them and what information to give them, which I wouldn't know any of that, obviously, if I hadn't been to college myself and then worked in this place. So the point of this slide is just that social class is a lot more than money. It impacts all areas of our lives. Here's some comparisons identified by Jody Kleeman that I've always found very helpful. How you can have the same experience in life or in a family that has very different iterations depending upon how much income you have, or very much different outcomes. So if I have a medical issue, if I'm higher income, I'm likely to have good insurance, access to medical specialists, right? And I'm pursuing that. If I'm lower income, I may not have good insurance. I might not be able to afford kind of going to all these extra doctors, which means that I'm going to wait till things get bad, and then I'm going to go to the emergency room. If I'm a teenager in a higher income family, then I'm usually getting money from my parents to support my activities. If I'm in a lower income family, I might be paying for my activities for myself and maybe even helping to support my family. If I'm of higher income, I'm living in a paid off house, and if something happens to me, my kids inherit the house. If I'm lower income, I'm living in subsidized housing, and if something happens to me, my kids don't have anywhere to live. The same types of activities that you could get you just simply expelled from your school if you're higher income will get you a criminal record if you're lower income. This became very apparent to me when I was an intern therapist at a incarceration facility for youth, and I was shocked at why they were in there. It was such for minor infractions, and I was thinking, this would have never happened in a family with money. They just would have hired a lawyer and their kid wouldn't have ended up here. If you have more money, it gives you access to expert opinions. If you have less money, you're less likely to have that information. And even as simple as if you have more money, you are driving versus taking the bus. And I thought of that a lot when I had little kids and it was a snowy day and I had to get my kids to daycare and to get myself to work, and what it would be like if I was doing that on the bus, and how much more challenging it would be, how I would likely be late to work, how I would have been in a job that I would have had to clock in and out, and I would have been much more likely to lose my job simply by the fact that I didn't have a car to get around more quickly. So what I would encourage you to do is think of some other things. What's something that your family has struggled with, and what does that look like if you have less money versus more money? And your family may have had less money or it may have had more money, but how does it change? How does money change things? Or, Cyndi Lauper would say, money changes everything. So how does it make a difference? Even just if you think about like parental addiction, that can be, oh, my mom goes to rehab versus my mom goes to prison. So, just a reminder in case you don't know this already, that poverty is dynamic rather than static. People can, if we think about the federal poverty line, people can move in, above and below that over time. And the key things that often get people to end up into poverty is, losing a job, for example, having a relationship dissolve or divorce, having the birth of a child, experiencing a disability, or increasingly young or emerging adults setting up their own independent household. The two primary ways are getting out of poverty are a change in your employment or becoming a two-earner household. Okay, so let's talk briefly about the family stress model, which is an outgrowth of family stress theory, but is more focused on economic stressors. And so what the family stress model helps us understand is, why does economic stress take such a toll on individuals and couples and kids? And I often wondered this, when I was in HDFS, whether as a student or a teacher, you always are running across those findings about how there are poor outcomes almost in whatever it is that we're talking about for people who have less money. And I was like, so why is that? Why does money change everything? And so the family stress model helps explain that, having economic hardship, not having enough money, leads to more economic stress, which can lead to people being, struggling emotionally. Depression is a common one, and can lead to more conflict in couple relationships. If the couple also has kids, then it's harder to be your best self. And I noticed this even if I wasn't stressed about money, which I certainly have been, although not at the level many people have to be over their lifetimes, but certainly have had times where I was pretty financially stressed. But even any type of stress in my life, it's harder to be a good parent. It's harder to be authoritative, to be both firm and kind. It's much easier to get either too permissive, like I'm distracted, whatever, or I'm comforting myself with my substances right now and I'm not monitoring you, or I get too reactive and I'm too harsh, I'm not staying in kind of an emotionally supportive place. And of course, then this has long-term effects on kids' well-being. So here's an empirical article example of the family stress model. And so these researchers studied the effects of economic and family stress on the likelihood of substance use by Mexican American youth. And it follows a very similar model that we've talked about already, that family income and negative economic events lead to economic pressure, which leads to distress in the adults, which then can lead to couple conflict, poor parenting, and negative outcomes for kids, in this case, adolescent substance use. But this study looked at the moderating effects of familismo or familyism on the relationship between parent-parental distress and the couple relationship, and found that familismo moderated those effects, basically meaning that people, mothers or fathers who were higher on a sense of familyism and a commitment to kind of the well-being of the family as a whole, were less likely to let their own emotional distress disrupt into parental conflict. And so in this way, familyism is a source of resilience and a buffer in the economic stress model, or the family stress model. Okay, we're going to finish up this lecture with a focus on ethnicity and an activity to help us understand our own ethnicity. So we have an online class participation activity associated with this. And so in it, you're going to be thinking about and describing your own ethnicity, which I'm defining here as the nationhood of your ancestors, past and present, the religion of your ancestors, past and present, and the language of your family, past and present. And then you're going to be also thinking about what are the sources of pride and shame for your family. So all of us, and I'll give you some more examples, but in our families, we have things that are really important for family values and that we're proud of. And we also have things that maybe we keep secret, or we look down upon, or we discourage. And it's important to know what our pride and shame issues are. Maybe, and this is a kind of another form of our biases, really, but what are our pride and shame issues as we go out to either research families or work with families? So I've listed a whole bunch of things on this slide that can be potential pride or shame issues. So it's common for people to say, my family values hard work. That's a common one. One that's like less common or can go either way is some families are really about family loyalty. Family first, we're loyal to the family. Other families, that's not so much of a value. Some families might have more pride around LGBTQ identities, whereas other families might have more shame, or maybe it's a mix. So each of these can be sometimes something is just a pride issue, or sometimes it's both. It can be an issue of pride or potentially an issue of shame if you don't have it. For example, if you don't have diligence, then it's shame, and if you do have diligence, then it's pride. So I just encourage you to be thinking, like, what are the pride and shame issues? And it might not even be anything here on this list. So it's easy for someone like me whose ancestors are white and have been in the US for a long time to fall into the trap of thinking that I don't have an ethnicity because I'm of the dominant culture and it's just invisible, like we've talked about already. But I would be considered Anglo-American, which is, or sometimes Euro-American, we call that, but Europe is a big country. I'm more from kind of English ancestors, England, Austria, Germany, and then more Protestant religious background and English speaking. Okay, so here's some examples of pride and shame issues in my family of origin. And so some of these are the flip of the same thing. So like many people, like my family valued kind of being hardworking, using your head, and it was shameful if you weren't using your head. What are you thinking? Use your head, you know. Honesty was a really big value in my family to the point that I have a really hard time not just confessing everything I've ever done wrong right in the moment, even if that's not really appropriate. And it also means that when I'm working with families who have different rules around honesty, maybe are more comfortable lying to people who are especially outside the family or even within the family, I could easily kind of be reactive to that and think that that's dysfunctional. So I have to be careful, right, about how my own issues, my own pride and shame issues influence my work. Another thing that my family really prioritized was education. And yet I noticed when I married my husband that his family really had pride issues around money. And his grandpa would be asking him, like, how much money are you making? Which no one ever asked anybody that in my family. Yeah, how much money are you making? And telling him how much money his cousins were making. And initially I thought that was, unhealthy and materialistic and, inappropriate. But I really came to realize that it was just like my family used education as a measure and as a way to make sure the kids were all right. His family used money that way. So my parents are putting in the Christmas letters like, Ashley's getting this degree, Thad's getting this degree, they're doing great. But my husband's family, they're talking about how much somebody's making good money, they're doing okay. So it's the same thing. It's just how do you, it's the value around it, and how do you know that everybody's doing okay and we can relax. So thinking of it that way helped me kind of understand just differences in family pride shame issues. So hopefully you'll have an interesting experience thinking about yours. Okay, haha, you're at the end again. Good job.